Welcome back. The wildfires in Canada are prompting air quality concerns throughout the state of Wisconsin. The latest advisory now in effect until noon tomorrow.
You really notice it out there. And right now, northeast Wisconsin is in the good to moderate range. However, the DNR predicting that tomorrow air quality conditions will worsen. And a first alert update, Samantha Cavalli shares what experts are saying and how air quality affects allergy season.
Air quality conditions are changing every hour of every day. The DNR says this is the second time this year they have enacted an advisory in relation to the Canadian wildfires. The Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources issuing an advisory to Wisconsinites, asking people to limit their time outdoors due to air quality concerns. Craig Zarnecki with the DNR says these advisories are becoming more frequent.
So usually, if we got wildfire smoke impacts, we would see them later in the summer, but now this is the third year in a row now. We've had wildfire impacts here in the spring.
2 years ago, northeast Wisconsin experienced unhealthy air quality due to Canadian wildfires. People impacted include those with asthma, heart and lung disease, the elderly, children, and those with severe pollen allergies.
When there are higher ozone levels, it stimulates more ragweed growth. So the more ozone we produce locally and across the country, the more ragweed pollen we're going to have.
Dr. Steve Kagan tells me he saw a delayed spring season, all tree and grass pollen arriving 4 weeks late. With the mix of the poor air quality and pollen, it's bringing in an unusual amount of patients to his practice.
If I'm a little kid, I'm not going to limit my time indoors. I'm going to go outside and have fun, play with my friends. And parents of children who have allergy should make sure they take their medications before they go outside, and certainly in the evening hours.
Zarnecki agrees. He encourages those most at risk to consider making outdoor activities shorter to decrease exposure.
They're nothing to take lightly, and certainly things to pay attention to, and people need to take action to make sure they're protecting themselves and their loved ones.
Green Bay, Appleton, and Oshkosh area schools all have air quality guidelines in place so that they can determine if the air is too unhealthy to send students outside. For the latest air quality information in your county, visit WBAY.com. Reporting in Fond du Lac, Samantha Cavalli, Action 2 News.